All right, so for the first presentation for today, I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the work that in my group we have been doing around learning and this intersection between learning and program synthesis in particular, and also a little bit of background around this relationship between program synthesis and learning. So a lot of the early work in my group was really focused on this particular paradigm of program synthesis called syntax-guided synthesis. And our high-level goal was that we wanted to help people write code. And especially we want to help people write tricky, messy, challenging pieces of code that normally they wouldn't really want to write by hand. And the idea was that if you have a challenging programming problem like this, what you can do is you want to tell the system something about what you want that piece of code to do, right? And this might be formal specifications, but it might just be input-output examples or safety properties, maybe some test harnesses that you want your piece of code to satisfy. But in addition to that, you also want to be able to provide the synthesizer some constraints on the structure of the piece of code that you want. And these constraints in our very, very early work, they actually took the form of a program sketch or a program skeleton that more or less captured the basic structure of the program you wanted, and it had just some missing details within it. But slowly we moved more towards things like just providing components or providing a little domain-specific language for the programs that you want to generate. And it turns out that this combination of constraints on the behavior and constraints on the structure of the program actually gave you a lot of power, a lot of flexibility. On the one hand, it allowed you to restrict the set of possibilities so that you made the program more tractable. It also meant that sometimes you could make up for deficiencies in your specification or for ambiguity in your specification by virtue of having strong constraints on how the code should look like. And in a lot of work in this space, for example, what you see is a lot of care is put into defining the language over which you're going to do program synthesis so that even with very sparse, very incomplete specifications, you can actually get things that do what you want. And this field has actually progressed quite a bit since the early days in the mid-2000s when we published the very first papers around this. And today, the community has made enormous strides and actually can do a really good job in synthesizing things like data structure manipulations, for example, right? We saw already in the tutorial yesterday, and we'll continue to see in the second part of the tutorial tomorrow, how program synthesizers can actually pretty efficiently synthesize even relatively complex data structure manipulations and even verify them correct. Data wrangling is another domain where this kind of approach to program synthesis has proven quite successful. If any of you have used flash fill before, that came out of research in this community around this combination of structural constraints and behavior constraints and this ability to then leverage this ability to search over programs in order to learn data manipulations from very small numbers of examples. Right now, all of these domains fall into what we can broadly understand as programming, right? These are things that programmers do. They write data structure manipulations, they write code to manipulate data. But even pretty early in this wave of program synthesis research, people in the community started recognizing that you could actually use this for more than just the traditional, here's my specification and I want a piece of code that comes out of it. There was this very influential paper by Suzmin Jha and Sumit Gulwani, Sanjay Seshia, and Ashish Tiwari back in 2010, where they had this really important insight where they said, look, normally we like to see synthesis as the programmer comes in, writes a specification, and out comes a piece of code. But what if we invert this? What if you already have an implementation? And what you're really trying to do is you're trying to understand what this implementation is doing. What you really want is from this implementation to actually extract a specification that tells you what this piece of code is going to do. And now, why would you want to do that? Well, this is particularly useful in situations where that implementation is opaque. You can't really understand the code that implements it directly, but you can feed it inputs and outputs and see what it does. And in fact, this first paper, they were looking at obfuscated code, right? And essentially leveraging synthesis as a mechanism for understanding what a piece of obfuscated code would do by just looking at these inputs and outputs and then treating those inputs and outputs as your behavior specification, combining that with some structural constraints about how that high-level form of the code should look like, and leveraging that to discover what this obfuscated piece of code was doing. This turns out to be a really, really powerful idea because you can use it not just for deobfuscating code, but in many situations where you have an artifact that you're trying to understand and that you want to generate a high-level model from it. For example, there was some work in PLDI 2012 that was looking at doing this for generating models of instructions so that you could do symbolic execution over those instructions. We had a paper ourselves back in 2016 where we looked at the problem of writing code against very complex platforms, right? So for example, if you want to write an application that runs on Android, your application might be tiny, right? It might just be 100 lines of code. But if you want to do any kind of analysis over it, to actually understand what it's doing, you have to know something about the Android platform. And the problem is the Android platform is huge. So you might think you have a 100-line application, but if you're trying to do any kind of program analysis over it, you actually have to analyze this huge body of code just to know what your application is doing. And so people generally don't do that. Instead, what they do is they create some kind of a mock-up of the platform that essentially abstracts away all the low-level details that are not relevant to your analysis. And you can think of it as sort of a cartoon version of the platform that just captures enough information of what you're trying to do. And so we figured out, hey, you could follow the same playlist. You could actually get some test applications, run them against the real platform, capture those traces, and then pose that as a synthesis problem to generate a model of these reactive frameworks that is able to, that is consistent with these traces, but that is this very high level simplified version. In that case, we really only cared about some of the reactive behaviors, how, for example, listeners get registered, and by doing this, you're able to now automatically generate this very high level model that nevertheless captures what you care about. The really big, to me, the really big step, however, came in 2013 with this paper by Ali Pascal et al. This was in the research group of my PhD advisor, Ras Bodik, where they decided to take that playbook and apply it in nature, apply it to actually understand biological processes. And in particular, they were interested in these regulatory networks that essentially describe how cells communicate. And so you have cell number one that maybe has some receptors, maybe can produce some molecules, and inside that cell, there's a network that says, oh, when you get to this lead-23 molecule attaching, then you're going to produce, or you're going to stimulate the production of this other molecule, and that is in turn is going to stimulate the production of another molecule, but maybe you also have another molecule that is suppressed by these. And so what you want is you want to discover these kinds of networks. What enhances what suppresses what. It turns out there's a lot of experimental data about how this works, but just like in the case of obfuscated code, we don't really have access to nice, clean source code for the cells, certainly not for the cells of these worms. And so what you have is a synthesis problem in the making. For each one of these, you also want to generate a little state machine that describes how, upon receiving a particular signal, the state of this protein is going, or of this molecule is going to change. Now, what was the raw data from which they were synthesizing? The raw data was essentially these experiments where they knock out different proteins and they see what happens. They essentially get the input is whether each of these molecules is present or absent, and the output is how these cells behave in real life, right? And so you can imagine running these experiments can be expensive and time consuming, but what the program synthesis allows you to do is it allows you to then take the results of these experiments and systematically reason about what these experiments imply about the underlying mechanism. Now, there's a little bit of complexity, for example, in that you have to deal with non-determinism. Basically, everything in a living organism is non-determinism. But one way to model it is that you can say, well, I have this particular program P. This is my hidden program that I'm trying to synthesize. And it takes as input this vector that describes how this organism has been mutated and what proteins are on or off, and a schedule that essentially describes the non-determinism as part of that process. And so you want a program that is capable of producing all the observations that you observed in the experiment, but is not capable of producing anything that you did not see experimentally. And so it turns out if you do this, you can actually generate some models. Now, one of the big benefits of this kind of approach and this kind of use of program synthesis is that not only can you generate a program that represents what's going on in this cell, you can generate multiple programs that generate what goes on in the cell. Now, this might seem a little bit funny. It's a bit like, when Groucho Marx says, if you don't like my principles, I have others. But it's actually super useful because essentially it allows you to capture the underlying uncertainty in the data that you have collected so far, and it allows you to now suggest new experiments that can disambiguate between different scenarios that are equally plausible relative to the data that we have. Question?
Two questions. One, on the last slide, was it that you don't want to model anything that the experiments don't show, or is it that you don't want to model anything that conflicts with the experiments?
Both.
Because, so if you don't want to model anything that the experiments haven't shown, are you then assuming that you have like a complete set of experimental data? Like have you done a complete knockout library, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, so there is an assumption here that you have observed enough of the cell fates to really actually capture what is possible in the model.
And then in this case,
are
there sort of ensemble statistics you give? Like, okay, so you have N models, if a particular edge or cycle is conserved across all N models, how do you identify?
It's hard to make statistical inferences out of a process like this because the underlying solver that is being used to search for this model really has no knowledge of underlying statistics. And so essentially you tell it to find you a program, and it finds an arbitrary program. And then you tell it, well, now find me a program that is different from this one. And it finds you a different program. But there's really no basis for the solver to know which one of these is more likely, or whether one of them has like 90% and the other one has 10% of the probability. So the way this is set up, you don't really have enough information to say anything statistical about it, only that there exist these two models that are both plausible with respect to the data. So this notion of leveraging program synthesis as a way to model things that occur in nature, and as a way of generating models that are not just predictive, but that actually yield an understanding of the underlying process, that actually reflect causality internally, and that support a broader set of counterfactual questions beyond simply, hey, what happens if I change this input, is actually a pretty powerful thing. A completely different domain where we applied a similar idea is this domain of understanding language morphology. Indeed, incidentally, I actually had to change the slide this morning because I just learned the paper just got accepted into Nature Communications. So the previous version of the slide just said in submission. We actually talked a little bit about this work early on, an early version of this work in a Neurosymbolic paper a few years ago. But what's the idea? So you want to understand language morphology. What in the world is that? Well, it's basically the rules that allow you to determine that, for example, the word open is actually constructed by taking the root of the word and then adding this suffix d to construct opened, right? And so the sorts of rules of language that tell you how to construct different forms of a word, they are, that's language morphology. There's also language phonology. These are the kind of rules that tell you, for example, that the past tense of walk, even though it's written like that, you actually pronounce it as walked, as opposed to walked, right? So there is this T sound at the end as opposed to the D sound. And so it turns out there's actually a set of rules that explain when that happens and why that happens. And so this is sort of best case scenario for this synthesis-based approach, in that on the one hand, we have a very well-developed language that linguists have been refining over the years for actually describing how language morphophonology works. So we didn't have to go and invent a brand new domain-specific language for doing this, or discover the formalisms. The formalisms were already there. At the same time, if you want to go and understand a new language, if you want to understand English, then that's pretty easy. There's a ton of written English language out there. But if you're trying to understand a small language, or a language that is not as widely used or as widely documented, then you might actually want to construct rules that describe the behavior of that language from a relatively small sample of words in that language. So in that sense, it is a very good fit for a program synthesis approach. It's not a perfect fit in that you can't quite frame it in the same way that we framed some of these other problems, where you say, well, I know what the inputs are, I know what the outputs are, I'm looking for this function that tells me how things work. In this case, when you consider the program, is essentially this set of rules that tell you how the language morphology and phonology works. But the input to those rules are things like the stem of the words. And we don't actually get to see those inputs. So we actually have to reframe the synthesis problem to be able to deal with unseen or unknown inputs. Essentially, what you're looking for is now the most likely program that, when you give it the most likely inputs, would produce this particular outputs. And unlike the previous case, in this case, a probabilistic view of the problem is absolutely essential, right? If you don't have a probabilistic view of the problem, there is a trivial solution to the problem of synthesizing a function when you can't see the inputs. You just say, oh, the function is the identity function, and the inputs are just the outputs that I observed, right? And you can fit all your data with that function, but it's not going to be a very useful function, certainly nothing that actually tells you something about your domain. But you can actually frame this as a synthesis problem, incorporate even some of the probabilistic information, and actually synthesize some pretty non-trivial rules describing the behavior of some of these languages. Unfortunately, I'm not fluent in Somali, so I cannot really even try to pronounce some of these words, but at the high level, what the system is doing is it is generating these rules that explain how stems are transformed, how suffixes are added, how sounds are transformed in these words in order to generate the observed version of these words. Yes.
Well, I guess to your previous point, how do you constrain, or where in the process do you constrain the complexity of the program that you synthesize?
So that's a good question. So as part of the synthesis process, essentially what you do is you have a prior over the space of possible programs, and you also have a prior over the inputs to the programs, in this case, the stems, this unobserved stems of the words. And so that prior distribution includes the fact that, for example, longer programs have lower probability than shorter programs, but it's a little bit richer than that. So this is pretty exciting, and these are some illustrations of how you can actually take some of these program synthesis techniques purely from the formal methods and programming languages world, and actually apply them to solve interesting problems that at heart are learning problems, but they have particular features that make the synthesis-based approach a little bit more of a better fit. The fact that you're able to get this very interpretable solutions, the fact that you can actually very explicitly characterize some of the ambiguity and actually even suggest new experiments, this makes for a very powerful combination. However, there's also some really big challenges, and one of the really big ones is scalability. Basically, we know how to synthesize around a dozen lines of code, give or take, depending on the complexity of your language and so forth. But what that means is that there's really only two ways in which we can tackle bigger, more complicated problems. Either we divide and conquer, and that is actually a pretty good option and something that works in many domains and allows you to actually tackle some pretty big problems. Or you can have a language that is very carefully crafted to allow you to express exactly the things that you need to express in a relatively small number of lines of code, right? So you can hide a lot of complexity behind a very high level domain-specific language. But it's not great. You would like to be able to scale better. Another issue is approximation and probabilistic reasoning. The moment you cannot completely assume that all your examples are correct, the moment you cannot completely assume that all your data is clean, or the moment the process you're trying to model itself has some probabilistic behavior over it, the cost of applying this kind of techniques increases dramatically. It can be done in some situations, and for example, in this example of this linguistics work, it was possible to actually do this, but it comes at a very, very high cost, and it can only be done in very limited cases. And finally, this kind of approach is a little bit reminiscent of what you had in machine learning before the advent of deep learning, where you really relied very heavily in that case on feature engineering. In this case, on very significant hand engineering of the space of programs that the synthesizer is going to consider to make sure that the synthesis problems that it has to solve are actually tractable enough. And so these challenges are really what has pushed the community in recent years to embrace neurosymbolic methods. The idea is that by combining these program synthesis approaches and ideas from these programming languages and formal methods community, and combining them with neural networks, we can actually do something more interesting. And there's a lot of different combinations that you can play with once you start exploring this intersection. Here's just a handful of particular combinations that we have explored. One combination that can be very powerful is where you essentially want to leverage the ability of these deep neural networks to associate meaning with very high level and structured inputs. Essentially, you can leverage them to bridge the gap from the very high level, ambiguous, fuzzy world to the symbolic world where the formal methods-based techniques excel. And so one example of that is, for example, if you're trying to generate code representation from hand-drawn drawings, right? So going from hand-drawn drawings to a symbolic representation of those hand-drawn drawings is something that a neural network can do quite well. And once you have that symbolic representation, now you can use that as it may be a specification for a synthesis process or as a symbolic input to a synthesis process. You could do something similar, for example, if you want to take natural language as an input to a synthesizer. You could, as a first step, convert that natural language into a more symbolic representation, and then from that, try to apply your formal methods-based techniques. The other approach that has actually become quite popular in the community and is quite powerful is this approach of neural guided search. Essentially, the idea is you're trying to leverage the ability of the neural network to learn very complex conditional distributions. In this case, essentially what you're learning is a complex conditional distribution over code, so that when you condition on a particular goal, a particular specification, then you get a piece of code that actually does what you want. And so the final artifact in this case is actually just a piece of code. The learning comes in at the point where you're trying to learn how to search over the space of programs. It's essentially a form of meta learning where you're learning how to synthesize particular programs so that when you run into a specific instance, you will be able to synthesize a program for that very efficiently. Yesterday, Osbert talked a little bit about this paradigm of program extraction. The idea being that for many situations, you can actually relatively easily learn a neural network that will accomplish the task. But for safety reasons or for interpretability reasons or for efficiency reasons, it might not be good enough to run the neural network in practice. And so you want to extract out of that neural network a more symbolic representation that is in the form of a program and that will give you some of these advantages. And finally, there are situations where you really just want to learn programs that have neural networks inside of them. And it turns out that this is a challenging problem because on the one hand, the symbolic part of the program can actually might not be very amenable to the kind of numerical optimization techniques that you rely on for training the neural network. There is this combination of combinatorial and continuous optimization that is necessary to do that. So this is a high-level snapshot of some of the different approaches, and I'm going to talk a little bit more in particular about neural guided search. All right, and the basic intuition is that a lot of the more traditional PL derived techniques for program synthesis can rely very heavily on what essentially amounts to exhaustive search. Usually that exhaustive search is done in a clever way to allow you to completely prune out regions of the search space that you know cannot contain a correct solution. But conceptually, you are still doing an exhaustive search and you are still searching the whole space. The problem with that, of course, is that there's a limit to how deep you can go in a search like this. Obviously, the more pruning you're able to do, the deeper you're going to be able to go in the space. But in general, it's going to be challenging to synthesize programs that are very deep and hard to reach in this space. The basic idea of neural guided synthesis is that we're not just going to explore the space exhaustively. Instead, we're going to direct that search towards programs that our training data tell us are more promising for the particular task that we're trying to solve. The idea is that by doing this, we might actually be able to reach much deeper into the search space, as long as the problem that we're trying to solve in production looks a lot like the problems we're trying to solve in during training time. And so in this case, the idea is that you're leveraging this ability of the neural network to learn these distributions for programs to help you find a program in the first place. But the final artifact, the final thing that you're trying to get is a program with a lot of the advantages and some of the disadvantages that having programs conveys. So to give you a sense of where you might be able to do this and where this might be productive, this is actually from a paper led by Max Nye back in 2020, where we're looking at a particular set of problems that actually Brandon Lake had been exploring at NYU, had been exploring more from the cognitive science side, and looking at the ability that people have to very quickly discover, very quickly identify patterns in the data. And so in this case, what you have is a completely made up language for a completely made up task. So here we have, for example, 4 commands in this language. And essentially what they do is they draw this little dots. And we also have some functions that you can apply in this language. That, for example, there's a function called DAX, or sorry, a function called FEP that you can apply here. Can anybody guess what this function FEP might do? What are the semantics of this FEP construction here?
Repeats the dot again.
Yeah, so essentially here, for example, we have this DAX command that says, draw a red dot, and FEP essentially says, do that 3 times, right? And, some of them can even get a little bit intricate. You can have complicated compositions of these. And it turns out, if we look at these carefully, humans are actually pretty good at figuring out what these kinds of things mean and the semantics of these sorts of things. They're not perfect, but humans can do pretty well at just taking a handful of examples and generalizing from them and figuring out the solution. It turns out traditional or even relatively recent machine learning, not so much. For example, here's a particular architecture that Lake proposed as part of this work, where essentially you take all of the examples and you generate an embedding for those examples. And then you use that as input to a network that then is going to look at the next case and produce an output for that, right? And it turns out that you can actually train a network to do this, and it can sort of try to solve the problem, but not really, and not so well. And it shouldn't be a surprise that a program, if you have a program that actually describes this behavior, it can do much better than this code, because after all, this is a pretty symbolic task. And these are things that actually can be represented fairly well as programs. The challenge is, of course, generating those programs from only a small number of examples. But it turns out you can actually use this neural guided search paradigm to actually propose essentially a distribution of programs, check those programs against your examples to make sure that you're actually selecting the program that is consistent with all of your examples. And if you do that, we find that for a set of complex tasks, we can actually do much, much better than a lot of the prior approaches. Turns out we could actually take this exact same underlying DSL and actually use it to generate essentially programmatic interpretations of number words in different languages. Essentially use it from a few examples to have it figure out how number words work in different languages. And again, you can do it much better than an approach that is entirely neural and that also requires more data. Now, in this case, though, there is this very clear, crisp separation. Essentially, the synthesizer itself is neural, is purely neural, and it is generating these purely symbolic programs. But it turns out that you can actually, in some cases, do better than that by adding some neurosymbolic aspects to the synthesis process itself. And so here's an example of another paper that was also led by Max and I that was focusing on the following problem, right? So when you're doing this neural guided search, the picture that I showed before, this is the happy case. This is the case where everything works exactly as you expected. Oftentimes you might end up in this case, right? Where you have an example that you have a problem that looks, close to the things in your training distribution, but not quite there, right? And so it turns out when you try to solve it, you can't. You might end up exploring some programs that are really, really close to your correct program, but wrong in some important details. That means that you're not actually reaching your solution. And so the high-level idea in this work is, well, could we rely on the neural network to essentially get us close, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be perfect. And then rely on these more traditional, more exhaustive search techniques to now search in the neighborhood of this program that we found in order to actually get the correct solution. And so in particular, the idea looked something like this. So in this case, we're trying to generate programs from a combination of hard constraints input-output examples in this case, things that you can actually take a program and test it and say, yes, this program is doing the correct thing, or no, it's not doing the correct thing. As well as some soft constraints, in this case, natural language inputs that, that describe the program that we're looking for. And I should preface this by saying that this was, at the time, we didn't have this huge language model, so the language part of this is actually quite weak. But you can see here that even if the language part is really, really strong, right, just from the sentence drop some elements, it's going to be hard to figure out exactly what elements you're trying to drop. That you have to figure out from the examples. But what you find is that, well, if I'm dropping stuff, I probably will need a filter, and I'm going to be filtering on the inputs. And I'm going to be passing a function to that filter. So far, everything I've generated out of this program is entirely predictable. It's just when it gets to the details of exactly how am I filtering that one has to actually think a little bit hard. And so the idea is, well, what if the neural network is allowed to leave behind a hole? To essentially say, this is what I'm sure of, and this is what I'm not so sure of. And so for that, you're going to have to go to your symbolic synthesizer to actually work out the details that are going to make this program match the examples, right? And so the idea is to have this division of labor between the things that the learning-based algorithm is able to do really well, identify those patterns, those regularities in the data, but leave it to the symbolic search to do the things that symbolic search is much better at doing. This exhaustive search for the low-level details that, even a person looking at it might not be able to immediately tell what that looks like. So now the question is, how do we do that? Neural networks are notoriously bad at knowing what they don't know. It's just the nature of the problem. But it turns out that in many cases, what we're asking the network here is not so much to know its certainty. We're not too worried about the unknown unknowns. We're more worried about just things that have a lot of variability in given the specification. And so the idea is that we're going to have a training scheme where from an input, if you get exactly the right answer, then clearly there's no penalty. You did everything right. You produced the right code. You did exactly what you were supposed to. But if you get something wrong, then we're going to penalize you. We're going to penalize you really hard, right? Maybe it got the wrong function. Maybe it got the wrong constant. If you get it wrong, you are going to be penalized pretty high. But if instead you output a whole, there's still going to be a penalty, but the penalty is going to be proportional to how much work it would take to replace that whole with, essentially to discover the contents of that whole. So essentially the more of the function that is being, that has to be discovered from this whole, the more expensive, the higher the penalty is going to be. And so if you have this whole, then it's going to be a medium penalty. If you have this whole, it's going to be a low penalty. If you have this whole, it's going to be a really high penalty, because essentially the neural network is just giving up and not telling you anything, right? And so what you want is you want to train this to identify what parts of the data have enough variability that they're just not very predictable, and you're better off just replacing them with a whole rather than risking getting wrong. But at the same time, it's being pushed to make these holes very local as opposed to more global. And so how well does this work? Well, we tested this on a handful of different tasks. Here's some results from the paper. So what we're comparing here against, so the purple line is a more pure neural guided synthesis approach, right? This is the robust fill paper. It was one of the earliest, not the earliest, neural guided synthesis work. And so essentially compared that one is just a flat line. It's just what percentage of the problems you're able to solve with that approach. And then you have two approaches that do search. Our approach called Sketch Adapt, and an approach based on DeepCoder that essentially is first using a neural network just to tell you which components are likely to be useful, but then just doing exhaustive search using those components. And what you can see is what fraction of the problems are solved as a function of how much you have searched, right? So you can see that our approach can solve a non-trivial fraction of the problems without searching anything at all. These are essentially the problems for which no holes were actually emitted by the network. The network just said, I'm sure what the solution is, this is the solution. And you get the solution. And so as you do more and more search, if you do enough search, if you search enough, then you can solve a lot of these problems, even without neural guidance. It's just that search is expensive. But here's something really interesting that happens when you take a model that was trained on programs of a particular length, and then you try to use it to synthesize longer programs, essentially programs that were outside of its distribution. Now, all of a sudden, you can see that the neural baseline is not doing so well, as we would expect. We're pushing it outside of its training distribution. But the search-based approaches are able to do better. And you can see now that you're taking this out of its distribution. So the fraction of things that it's able to do with no search is now much smaller, but it still is able to leverage that learning that it was able to do in order to get more problems with less search. Here's another experiment where we're looking at the effect of the size of the training set, where you can see that if you have a big training set, a big enough training set for the task, the learning only model can actually do quite well for this set of tasks. But as you starve it of training data, then it's not really able to do as well. And so these are a couple of examples of how by bringing in this combination of neural and symbolic reasoning, you can do things that are difficult to do purely with one kind of model or the other. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over this last part and instead just jump straight to the conclusion to say that I think it's a very exciting time right now where we have this opportunity where there is this broad open space of different possibilities for bringing together some of these different strands of reasoning, and where I think the impact could be quite high, especially in some of these domains where you're trying to do learning not just for the sake of making predictions, but really for the sake of understanding an underlying system. I think this is particularly important for things like scientific discovery. But as we saw before, even when it comes to reverse engineering systems, it can be quite valuable. And so with that, I would like to open for questions. Sure.
Thank you for the wonderful talk. So regarding the last part of the talk on the neural research, if the suggestion contains a hole, how are you still evaluating the penalty in that case as to how useful the proposed structure is containing the hole?
So you basically have to first just check the parts that are not holes to make sure that those parts are correct. And you basically have to, if I remember correctly, you have to pre-compute the different places where you can have holes and their relative costs.
Sorry, I'll follow up.
Yeah, we can talk more offline.
Okay, so you're talking about the neural guided synthesis, which obviously needs to be labels to train this network, which you touched on briefly. I could see that, like, for certain categories of problems, like labels would be a huge bottleneck for this kind of system. So, like, is there any path you can see towards making this fully unsupervised?
So I think there are interesting things that you can do with, probably by relying on, priors captured either as part of, some broader training. Maybe you're using some large language model, for example, to give you some priors. I think this is still a pretty open question.
Gotcha. Yeah. My follow-up question to that was, do you ever see this kind of a system being used to extract symbols directly from the data set?
So this is a really good question. And it touches upon this. There is this work called Dreamcoder that was alluded to in some of the talks yesterday, where one of the things that we're trying to do is precisely that, be able to identify from the data set some symbols. We are assuming in that work that you have a ground level of symbols that allow you to describe the problems on your domain, but might be just too low level. And essentially bootstrapping from that and building higher and higher level symbols that better represent your domain. This is part of trying to make the style of neurosymbolic reasoning a little bit more like deep learning, in the sense that of not needing to predefine all of your features or all of your language, but instead being able to induce that directly from the data itself.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
So we saw, like, we could ask the model to, like, synthesize programs from, like, different types of inputs. For example, it could be like natural language, or like input-output examples, or like formal specifications. But, like, how do you see the trade-off between, like, all these kind of inputs? Because I feel like if the input is like natural language, then it's kind of like fuzzy, and it's kind of like hard to, like, prove that the program is actually going to work. But again, like, if the input is like formal specification, or like input-output examples, then I feel like in many complex tasks, like, it may not makes like too much sense to write these formal specifications or input-output examples, because you may not have like input-output examples at all. Like, if you're making a website, then what's the output going to be, and what's the specification going to be? Yeah. So how do you see the trade-off? I mean, you could always, like, sort of translate from natural language to like formal specifications or like input-output examples, but again, like, you need the training data to train the model, like the neural net, and yeah, like, how do you collect the data?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And this, at the high level, we talk about this as the intention problem, right? And how do you capture what people are trying to do? In the traditional synthesis literature, one of the big ideas that has been pushed for this is multimodal specification, where any individual mode of input might not give you enough information to fully constrain the program and actually get you the program that you want. But by combining information in a few different modes, you can actually have enough information about the piece of code that you're trying to do. Doing this in the neural context, on the one hand, it opens a lot of exciting possibilities because now you're not just restricted to formal kinds of inputs, right? And in the traditional synthesis literature, when people talked about multimodal inputs, it meant things like, I'm going to provide you a few input-output examples, and I'm going to provide you with some assertions, and I'm going to provide you with an invariant. But now you can actually say, oh, and I'm going to provide you with a hand-drawn image of how I want the data structure to look like, for example. One of the things that we found useful is to distinguish between hard and soft constraints, where the hard constraints, you can actually check the program mechanically and see that whether it satisfies them or not. For the soft constraints, really the only thing they can do is influence the distribution of programs that you're considering through the neural network. But it's very hard to take, for example, a drawing and to formally check and say, yes, this program matches the drawing. Something that has been tried is to essentially first take the fuzzy inputs and make them formal, make them, turn them into hard inputs, and then try to enforce that. But there's still always that step where you can't be really sure that your formalization of the soft input is really what you wanted.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Do you know, do you know of any work that kind of tries to do that kind of thing, like multimodal synthesis using like language models or something like that? Like, is it like done or is it?
Well, actually, in the talk later this afternoon, AlphaCode is an example of this kind of multimodal synthesis, where you have both hard constraints in the form of concrete inputs and outputs against which you can test the program, as well as natural language descriptions, which are relied very heavily to actually get you to the right program.
Okay, one last question. I think you also touched on the symbolic execution. So how do you see the role of do you see in promising language model executing these programs using this kind of I'm sure some of the works from by Max Nye, Scratchpad, asking them to solve all the traces between before they give the actual output. How do you see do you think language model can do that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of really exciting questions right now around how do you get the language model itself to do more symbolic reasoning, and at the same time, how do you get the language model to leverage symbolic reasoning as it's doing the work. For example, one of the things that we are seeing nowadays is a lot of excitement around these, chain of thought prompts that, just by telling the model to show more of its work along the way, you can get higher quality solutions. But in addition to that, once the model is actually showing its work, you can check it, right? And in many domains, you can check it mechanically and actually be able to tell when something is going wrong and correct it. And I think there's a lot of interesting questions around how do you get more fruitful interaction between the neural models and the kind of modules that we already have at our disposal from the symbolic world. We have tremendous ability to reason about programs, to verify them, to even look at incomplete programs, for example, and be able to tell that they're just not going in the right direction. And so how do we leverage that in this neurosymbolic world?
Okay, yeah, makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the talk. So you talked about ML and PL and program synthesis for science, and past ideas like TableRL or some of these or HMMs. They've tried to learn policies for medicine or for some of these domains that are very data limited. Do you think that that program synthesis can overcome some of these past failures or shortcomings? And how can program synthesis sort of do this in ways that other more classical machine learning techniques may have not been able to solve these problems, especially when looking at these limited data domains?
That's a really good question. I think one of the big things that program synthesis brings to the table is this extreme flexibility in defining your hypothesis space, right? So a lot of work in machine learning is of the form, hey, here is a model class, right? And here's a specialized algorithm that works for that model class. And here's a bunch of properties that this model class has. And then we're going to learn with that model class, not because it's an exact match to what we need for the domain, but because it's what's there, right? And it's what we know how to use. One of the things that you get with program synthesis is the ability, this extreme flexibility in defining your own model class. So for example, in the linguistics case study, right, we were able to just take textbook linguistics formalisms and just encode them in a domain-specific language and learn the model precisely in terms of this, this formalism, which is exactly the formalism that the experts in the field use and understand. Now, this is more useful in domains where you already have a lot of background knowledge and where you already have rich formalisms that people have been studying for many years in which to ground your synthesis work. If you're going into a domain where you actually have no idea what's going on, where you're actually just trying to understand, come up with any hypothesis about what's going on, then it's not going to be such a good fit, right? And if you have no data and no prior knowledge, then there's only so much that computer science can do for you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the talk. I had a quick question. You mentioned earlier in the talk that the idea of synthesizing multiple models that are consistent with whatever your input in is able to capture uncertainty in the original spec or data itself. I was curious on how you would quantify or characterize that uncertainty and what additional information might you need from the domain in order to do so?
That's a really good question. One of the things about that work is that there are really no probabilities involved whatsoever, right? And so oftentimes in real life, what you might end up with is a situation where the space of models that are consistent with the data is very large or even infinite. But some of those models are completely implausible and can be ruled out on just the basis of prior knowledge. In the probabilistic programming context, it is possible to do that better, to actually impose a distribution over your space of programs and actually get a posterior over the space of programs that are consistent with your data. And you're going to hear a lot more about the style of reasoning later today. But this is a line of work that really cares about not just getting something that is consistent with the observations, but really being able to sample and fully characterize what that posterior looks like so that you can better direct your efforts.
And in the former case, you mentioned that sometimes these models are implausible based on prior knowledge. Is that prior knowledge, is that something that can't be incorporated into the original spec or however you originally directed the synthesis?
So if that prior knowledge is Boolean, right, is you can certainly do that, right? You can just add a constraint that says, don't give me models that have this property or that don't have this property. It's when you have to incorporate probabilistic prior knowledge that you really need to be able to do this probabilistic reasoning that's where the more traditional synthesis approaches have a lot more trouble.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hi. I think a lot of programming is like creating the code, and then once you have the code, there's a lot of editing. And something I'm curious about is what you think some of the challenges of editing existing code that is functional, but maybe isn't exact to the specification, like what the challenges might be, and maybe some promising approaches.
Yeah, so that's a really good question, right? When we write code, the code that you get on that first pass is almost never correct, right? And there's always then a debugging process where you're looking to take a piece of code, see how it's misbehaving, and based on that misbehavior, edit it. There has been some work that has been looking at that problem, both as part of the program synthesis problem as a way of iteratively generating code, as well as part of automated bug finding, right? You might have buggy code that was written by a human that has bugs and that you'd like to fix automatically given some test cases, for example. The key there is that you want to be able to establish a conditional distribution that relates the observed incorrect behavior and the observed existing code and relates that to the kinds of fixes that you might need in order to correct the code. I think this is an area that probably deserves even more attention just because of the iterative nature of actual software development that is generally not captured in this kind of models that just give you the first thing that they think is correct.
Great, thank you.
Relay race.
Thank you for the talk. And so whenever we apply for synthesis, it's incredibly important to design the system GSL. So we want it to be flexible enough to capture the right model, but we want it to be restrictive enough to make the search trackable. So maybe as a result, this is why we see in each application there are a lot of hand engineering in that process. So do you think in the future this is something we can mitigate, or maybe just being specific to each problem is just what we should do?
So I think there's a lot of, I think this problem is really, really important. And there is early work looking at this problem of inducing the domain-specific language directly from the data. I think it's still at the early stages. I think there's still a lot to figure out about how to do this better, because I think this really is one of the crucial problems in terms of making this kind of technology more accessible. If you need a PhD in programming languages in order to design the language before you can do any kind of synthesis, that puts a very high barrier for experts to use this technology. It means that anybody that wants to leverage this technology really needs to partner with an expert in the field. And so I see this as one of the key problems in making this technology more accessible. All right, so, well, one more question. Mm-hmm.
Hi, thanks for your talk. So the approach of using program synthesis to develop models that can explain your data seems really powerful for a lot of areas of experimental science. And you also mentioned something about the possibility of actually identifying or generating the experiments that could distinguish between different models. And that seems really powerful and interesting to me. I was wondering if you could talk more about that and if that problem of identifying experiments is also classed as a program synthesis problem, or if that's handled in a different way.
Sure. So the way you framed this, problem is you have your constraint coming from the data, you have your constraints coming from prior knowledge, and you can ask the synthesizer to synthesize a model in the language that is consistent with the data. And then you can add additional constraints to tell it, now find me another model that is also consistent with the data, but such that there is an input on which that new model is going to behave differently from the old model. So you don't want a new model that is different in just cosmetic ways or syntactic ways. You want a model where there's actually an input to the model that is going to cause the two of them to behave differently. And in characterizing the input and in characterizing what you consider different behavior, you can then push to generate a model where that difference is going to be exposable through the kind of experiments that you are actually able to perform, right? So in this case, for example, what you're looking for is your inputs are these mutations. And so you're looking for two models such that there is a set of mutations that are going to generate an observable difference in behavior that is going to be easy to test experimentally, right? You might have a model that is going to behave very differently internally, but if the observable output is the same, it's not going to make for a very good experiment. And so you can characterize in the way you set up this problem, what is the space of experiments that you can actually consider, what are the things that you can provide as inputs, what are the things that you can actually observe and measure well, and frame this as a synthesis problem. It gets more interesting and a little bit more complicated when you also need to take into account probabilities. So whether it is because maybe your experiments are probabilistic, and so you want to find not just the model that is different, but the model that is going to be different and where that difference is going to be exposed with high probability through the experiments you can run, for example.
Very cool, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's thank Armando one last time.
Thank you.